All right. Hello, everyone. I have an incredible guest with you, Professor Ayesha Jalal. Let me introduce Professor Jalal. Professor Jalal is one of the world's most leading expert on South Asia and one of Pakistan's most renowned historian. She has taught at prestigious universities and been associated with universities like Columbia University, Harvard University, and is currently a professor of history at Tufts University. She's also the author of around 9 books and has been the recipient of many awards, including Pakistan's third highest civilian award, the Sitara-e-Imtiaz. Today, we'll be talking about her work, and in particular with this book, The Soul Spokesman. I hope it's visible. Uh,
I haven't seen that cover. Show that to me again. Where is this, an Indian pub?
Yeah, it's the Indian version of the Cambridge.
It's awful. I don't particularly care for it. Anyway, fine. Go ahead.
All right. So, Professor Jalal, before we start discussing about your work, I'm interested to know what led you to study history in particular. Is it something that you've always been interested in?
Yes, I think to some extent I was, but I think that questions lead you to history. When you have questions about the present for which you have no answers, then you are compelled to study history. So I think that I had some questions about the present for which I sought access to history.
Questions about the present.
They could relate to political questions. They could relate to social, cultural, whatever questions that you need a better grasp of, because things don't happen overnight. And so you need to understand the historical context in which, I believe that there's a very close connection between the past and the present. And so we're in constant engagement. So when you have questions about the present for which there is no obvious answer, then recourse to history can help in certain respects. So in that sense, the question guides your approach, in my view, because you are in engagement in a dialogue with the past to answer something in the present.
Is this also what led you to write The Soul Spokesman? Because
Yes, I did have questions about the present. To be very specific, I wanted to know whether the official point of view in Pakistan that the country was solely created in the name of religion, which was what the mantra was of the military regime of General Ziaul Haq. I wanted to examine that in a scholarly way, to what extent that was true.
So when you wrote The Soul Spokesman, your argument was essentially that Jinnah was using the idea of Pakistan as a sort of kind of as a bargaining chip, not exactly as that.
Look, this bargaining chip thing has created more misunderstanding, largely because I think people assume that anything that is a bargaining chip, stupidly, they think is false. I think that's the great idiocy. To sort of dismiss the seriousness of the demand by saying all politics is negotiable. So it is a question of striking a bargain. It's a question of politics is a matter of compromise. So yes, he was using the demand for Pakistan to negotiate a power sharing arrangement for Muslims in an independent India. That's what the argument is. The question is, why didn't that not succeed? So one shows that in my work, or why that didn't work.
So would you say that strategy is perhaps a more accurate word, that Jinnah was using it as a sort kind of strategy to achieve his aims?
There's a difference between tactics and strategy. Yes, his goal was strategically, he was seeking a way to get Muslims an adequate share of power, equitable, or if not parity, in an independent India. So tactically, he changed things during the course, what he did tactically. So strategically, yes, he was looking, this was a power sharing arrangement strategy.
So Well, that's interesting because when you use it as a sort of strategy, there are obviously going to be different sections of Muslims because there wasn't this single idea of what Muslim nationhood meant. So he had to reconcile different ideas, different
Yes,
sections
he
of
had he
Muslims
had
and
to
bring them.
balance the different interests. I mean, everybody does. I mean, there's no such thing as a single point of view. This is not specific to Muslims. It's true to anyone
Yeah.
in any context that you have to balance sometimes contradictory, sometimes just varied interests. And so, yes, which is one of the reasons I argue that he tried to project himself as the quote unquote sole spokesman. That was his aspiration. And that's how he presented himself, because he knew that there were so many divisions and so many different voices that it would never sort of make a difference at the all India level, and would always allow the Congress to argue that Muslims speak with multiple voices. So he wanted to project a single voice, and in that he had to create a discursive notion of the Pakistan demand and to allow himself the room to maneuver with both the British and the Congress.
But for him to speak with a single voice, he had to also create a single kind of ideology, or at least that's how he presented
yes, I mean, it
such.
was the Pakistan demand as it came to be seen was, I mean, he said, I mean, that the word Pakistan, I mean, the Hindu press fathered this word upon us, but I mean, there's a much longer trajectory of this, idea, which comes to be seen as Pakistan. I mean, it has its origins as early as, the Jinnah's 14 points. So I think it's a question of understanding that longer history. So I think that's important. So he does manage. I mean, he does certainly after the outbreak of World War II, when he's asked to present a demand, he does come forward with the Muslim League's Lahore resolution, which comes to be defined without the Muslim League ever mentioning the word Pakistan or partition by the Hindu press as the Pakistan demand. So I think that's important to understand that construct is also that of I mean, it's not the Muslim League's own construct. They had a set of demands, which are then sort of negotiated by Jinnah in that document, the Lahore Resolution of 1940.
But at the same time, when he presents the two-nation theory, he also sort of gives way to different elements of nationhood, which would then form present the our current understanding of Pakistan as it exists in contemporary.
I mean, I think that's too vague. I mean, what is your question?
Because the two-nation theory as such is premised upon the idea that.
I mean, the question is, what is the two-nation theory? I mean, how did Jinnah use it? What is exactly the two-nation theory? I mean, the two-nation theory, he used it for political. I mean, the important thing to realize is that the Muslims, whether you like it or not, you don't have to subscribe to the two-nation theory. The fact of the matter is that in the final end game, Muslims were a separate political category in the British representative system. And Jinnah came forward to represent that category. Simple as that. So you don't have to subscribe to the two-nation theory as such, ideologically or in any way, to simply accept the empirical fact that Muslims were a separate political category.
But saying that Muslims are a separate political category is different from saying that Hindus and Muslims cannot live together, which is sort of what
he never said that they cannot live together. He was always suggesting that there has to be an accommodation, that there has to be a sharing. I mean, the presumption, I mean, how do you live together? I mean, this was about power sharing. I mean, clearly Hindus and Muslims are still living together, however awkwardly in India. But the fact of the matter is that this was a political question. I mean, the problem with the way you are taught Partition and Jinnah is that you think that all of it is because of religion, and that's a stupidity, because it's nothing to do with religion. It's about politics. Why don't you call it politics and not religion? Jinnah was not a very religious man. He was a constitutional lawyer, and he was trying to project a political movement. I mean, that's what he was doing, and Pakistan was that political strategy. So, I mean, and how does it come about? Well, there's a political category of Indian Muslims which has been there since 1909, and he steps forward to speak on behalf of this category in the end game before the British decolonization. That's basically what it is.
But I taking as an example Ambedkar's, use of scheduled caste as a political category. He did not say that they were a separate nation, but he did say that, he did manage to give them a voice in the Constituent Assembly.
Yes, I mean, so the question is that Mr. Jinnah, I mean, if you read this old spokesman and understand it, I mean, he basically said that Muslims were not a minority. They were a nation by international standards. And because, I mean, he was trying to get around the problem that Muslims had been consigned after 1909 into being a permanent statutory minority constitutionally. So how do you get around that? One way would be to sort of abandon the minority status altogether. But that was not acceptable to his constituents who were used to certain sorts of privileges and concessions that the category gave them. So he then sort of decided to metamorphosize a minority discursively into a nation. That's what the Lahore Resolution did in March 1940, that Muslims are not a nation, but not a minority, but a nation entitled to equal treatment as the Hindu nation, because he says that, if I mean, in the Constituent Assembly, that's going to determine the fate of India. Brother Gandhi will have 4 votes and I shall have 1. But in the family of nations, big and small are equal. So the metamorphosis of the Muslim nation into Muslim minority into a nation was designed to alter the basis of the settlement towards treating Muslims on an equitable level, regardless of their numerical strength. So it was a way to get around the problem of minority status. That was what his two-nation theory, if anything, was designed to do, but it was designed to arrive at a power sharing arrangement, not, as you assume, to divide the two. I mean, the problem with the mindset with which you are taught this in your country, not to mention in Pakistan, they have their own problems, is that you assume that Pakistan equaled partition, which is not true at all. I mean, if you read Ambedkar as well, his book, Pakistan or Partition, you will see that he makes a distinction between the two and says that if you do not accept the Pakistan concerns that are being voiced, that there will be a partition. This is what he wrote. Now, that's exactly what happens during the course of 1940 to 47, that the Pakistan demand cannot be confused with partition, which it is, because you take the end game and assume that this is what he was after all along. I show quite clearly that his Pakistan demand was meant to arrive at a power sharing arrangement, either between 2 separate states on the basis of that they are sovereign states and they arrive at treaty arrangements, or as elements of a confederal arrangement. They settled there on the basis that, I mean, he always argued that Pakistan represented the Muslim majority provinces, Hindustan, the Hindu majority provinces. He never spoke until the very end of India and Pakistan. He always spoke of Pakistan and Hindustan. They had to negotiate because his argument was that the center was a British construct. When they quit India, this center will have to be refashioned on the basis that there was a Pakistan demand and also on the basis that there were princely states. So these were his arguments. He left it an open question whether the two countries would separate as sovereign states, but even then they would have to have treaty arrangements, or they would be in a confederal arrangement between Pakistan and Hindustan and the princely states in a unitary federal center. And that is corroborated by his decision in 1944 to reject Rajagopalacharya's offer for a Pakistan that would be based on a divided Punjab and Bengal, as well as during the Cabinet Mission Plan of 1945, when he opted to work a federal tier system. I mean, so the point I'm trying to make is that the partition of India is effectively the partition of Punjab and Bengal, something Jinnah was dead opposed to. And that was the demand that was voiced by the Hindu Mahasabha and adopted by the Congress. And that is the partition of India for all practical purposes.
But at the same time, he was at best ambiguous about whether there should be a division of India or Pakistan. At times, he was at best ambiguous about the division of India and
Well, he had to
Pakistan.
be ambiguous when you are dependent on others to agree. You have to be ambiguous in politics. No politician reveals all his hands. I mean, his cards at the same time. So the ambiguity was written into the situation.
And at
He did
times
not have all the
contradictory,
cards.
because he did say that armed forces should be divided, that the state of Pakistan should be absolutely free and independent and sovereign, that
Yeah,
there will be
you
a
can pull
transfer.
out, you have to contextualize the whole thing. You can't pull
Mhm.
out, things that he says in 46 and then, use them for 1930s or whatever. I think I think you have to read it systematically. And I think that's all I can say. I mean, I think, I don't believe that Mr. Jinnah was fighting for the partition of the sort that emerged. That is the end product, but was not his intention. He wanted a Pakistan, but to say that what emerged in 47 was the Pakistan he wanted is fallacious. That's all.
So when he accepted the cabinet mission plan, do you think that was what he was fighting for?
Yes, I think the cabinet mission plan was designed to accommodate Mr. Jinnah. It was, we all know that the British used the sort of the inside understanding of someone like Chaudhry Zafrullah to devise a plan that Jinnah would accept. Jinnah's problem was that he didn't want to come into the Federal Assembly, Constituent Assembly, until he was assured his weight. So he wanted to consolidate the provinces at the grouping level, at the second tier, and bring their combined weight at the all India level. So if he puts them under a whip, then they can't break ranks and join the Congress. This is what his problem was. So he wanted the grouping. I mean, if you read the the Lahore resolution, it's also emphasizing grouping of provinces. So grouping was vital for him. He wanted to use the weight of the Muslim majority provinces at the all India level, right? But by partitioning Punjab and Bengal, as the Congress insisted upon, that weakened his ability to claim a share that was equitable. So he preferred at the cabinet mission level to accept a federal arrangement with no certitude of the Muslim share, rather than accept the partition of Punjab and Bengal. So that is the problem. I mean, I think that there is a logical problem in the way this is presented, because there's a presumption that Mr. Jinnah wanted the partition of Punjab and Bengal, which he did not. He did want a Pakistan, and what he says until the very end is that it's a mistake to confuse the partition of the provinces with the principle of Pakistan.
Well, I do agree with that, because he was insistent upon, the non-partition of Punjab and Bengal, the unity of Punjab and Bengal till the end.
So he's using, so the point is that that's exactly what the issue is. It eventually boiled down to the partition of Punjab and Bengal. That's where the partition occurred.
He also saw, I think, that the disaster that partition was going to bring, because
I don't think to be very honest, I don't think anybody fully anticipated the kind of Holocaust that occurred, I don't think that anybody anticipated, certainly not Mr. Jinnah. I don't think that he could have envisaged the horrors of partition, or anyone for that matter. It was far beyond what they expected. So I think that's something that we are still sort of trying to get our heads around. But I just don't think that, to say that he knew what would happen and still allowed it to happen would be unconscionable. And I just don't think that that's the case.
But he did think that there would be some conflict, because when the partition of Bengal was proposed,
there was, of course, conflict would. I mean, that's why he says that Bengal should stay united. What's the point of having Bengal without Calcutta? It's like asking a man to live without his heart. So when the Congress leadership, provincial leadership, and the Muslim League leadership come up with the possibility of keeping Bengal united, he endorses it. It's the Congress that says no. Bengal can only remain united in an independent, within the United India. Otherwise, there'll have to be a partition. So the Congress insists on partition of the two provinces under the influence of the Mahasabha. You can go and check your facts and decide for yourself.
Well, you're talking about the 1946 cabinet mission plan where,
No, I'm now talking about 47. I mean, the actual call for partition was given out on March 8th, after Attlee's announcement that the British will quit India by June 1948, come what may.
right. So I think that a lot of these problems about teaching history comes from the fact that we tend to sort of idealize and present black and white pictures.
No, I mean, the problem is that history is taught as ideology, not as history. And in a country like Pakistan, I think India has done much better at one level, even though you have a bitter battle over history right now. But you did manage to have good academic history. There's a difference between academic histories and official statist histories. So India has been able, despite all the problems with the teaching of history, to produce some excellent historical scholarship in the post-independence period. Pakistan, on the other hand, suffered because there very early on, and certainly by the decade of the 80s, you have the teaching of history as an academic discipline is simply eliminated in favor of what they call, quote unquote, Pakistan studies, which is really ideology. It's not history. So whilst you can say that in the case of India, at the official level, there was a Nehruvian paradigm that was thrust upon everyone, which is now being contested and pushed back, to another extreme. I think that scholarship continued to be produced at many levels in some of the finer universities of India, good historical scholarship. Pakistan can't claim that, because there, I think history as a discipline is eliminated by and large. It's only in the last decade or so that certain private institutions have revived the history curriculum, to teach history as a discipline. Sorry?
Despite the state.
No, despite the state, they have taken and that's the whole problem now, because that's being sought to be reversed with the so-called single curriculum, that the autonomy that certain private universities had to persist with, their own vision, like having a history major, a history curriculum, may be affected by this idea of a single curriculum, unless it is, like most politics, just rhetoric, which is, I think, probably is, it's the implementation that matters. But what I'm trying to say to you is that the teaching of history as a discipline ceased to be in Pakistan for several decades. And that has left a major mark, because what is considered to be history is really ideology and not history.
Well, I completely agree with that. And I think it's true even to a certain extent to India, although, there are many exceptions.
But I'm only sort of making a concession here of where India is different, is that you managed to produce some of the finest historical scholarship in South Asian history, all the individuals. I'm not saying this has anything to do with the state. At the state level, there are comparisons to be made, but I think that in terms of comparable scholarship, Pakistan has lagged behind, largely because of the way in which education institutions have suffered in Pakistan. I think that India is now coming into that ambit where, I don't know, but I do think that in the Nehruvian era, some excellent historians emerged. I'm not sure that the BJP has comparable quality historians. I just don't think so.
Do you think that history should be a subject at all in sort of public political discourse, because it's so...
It cannot but be. How can it not be? Because everything we talk about in terms of our present, we seek the legitimacy of the past or our interpretation of the past. How else are you going to legitimize your position when you make any kind of a political assertion? Politicians are constantly invoking history, supposedly, but usually that history is not a balanced view of history. It's an ideological, it's a partisan view. You cherry pick what you want to justify your position, but it's impossible not to bring history in. So history is extremely important, which is why it's so critical for us to, I'm not saying that there can be any agreement, but for us to know that these are contested and to keep the dialogue going, because without that, we'll never understand each other.
Is it really possible to have a nuanced version of history in political discourse or
No,
public
it's
discourse?
probably not with sound bites, but I do think that with people like yourself acting as the intermediaries between academia and the general public, things could improve. The quality of discourse could improve.
Right. So I also wanted to talk about decolonialism because you
Sorry?
brief about decolonialism, decolonizing history,
Yes,
because you
yes.
did mention it in a book that you co-authored with Professor Sugata Bose, Modern South Asia. So I think towards the end, you talk about decolonizing history. So I think that there is a conflation between decolonizing history and anti-colonialism, because we see only anti-colonial figures as being worthy of any attention at all, which leads us to ignore history from below, as it were, the fights of people like
Yeah, but let me
Ambedkar
let me
for political.
correct you. Let me correct you on one thing, and that is that anti-colonialism is not just the same as anti. As nationalism. I mean, I think anti-colonialism is a much wider category, and whilst I accept that history taught in India or in Pakistan focuses on the main leaders, I do think that there is an exhaustion with these leaders. We do need to look at those because they won power. Nehru won state power, and so it's all been a mantra about Nehru. But the question is that what about those with alternative visions whose view was left out? I think that if you look at the earlier period, the 20s and 30s, there were many leaders, people like C.R. Das in Bengal, his vision. That there were many people with very many different ideas. And I think that those are also interesting anti-colonial points of views that need to be looked at and perhaps are not looked at adequately. So when we speak of decolonization, basically the idea is not about a political decolonization, where the British quit India, but really a mental decolonization. I mean, the problem with the decolonization of history is that history itself as a discipline is such a Western construct. I.e. that the methods of history have been so deeply conflated with Western presumptions and false claims about their universal value, that we have struggled really to give history the sort of flexibility and the sort of acceptability to the populace, because it is a very sort of structured discipline. But I think that is changing now to a large extent. And I'm hoping that history that is written in the future will be much more accessible to the public. But there is a need, I mean, there is a divide between the academic world and the popular vision, because, that's sort of exposed to your media. Your media is pretty sort of out of whack, I think, if I may say so. Because I mean, whenever I've had a chance to listen to your talk shows, I think they're completely nuts. So I think that that's where you really are having a problem. It's and there I think that we don't talk about this enough, but the leaving everything to the so-called market, leaving or saying that your point of view is pointless, professor, because I have 1 million likes. So my point is that there is a problem with what's happening with thought. I mean, there is something to be said about thoughtful visions or views of history and just general chatter. So I think that that's where people like you, I hope, will serve us as intermediaries of getting a point across that is not that complex. But people don't like to read, but people are very opinionated. So I think that that's the problem.
Well, I do agree, because when it comes to the academic discourse, everyone is aware of your work and it's prescribed in almost all the
But
universities.
they're like different publics, we are in different spheres of discussion, aren't we?
Right. So, but in public, the discourse is completely different, and the hegemony that the official narrative has retained both in India and in
Because it's the
Pakistan, which
state
is
backed. The same in Pakistan, the same in Pakistan. But there's one big difference, which I leave you to think about, and that's that India is a democracy, or has been. Pakistan's an authoritarian state for the most part of its history. But the people are actually quite skeptical about history in Pakistan, which is not the case in India. So I think democracy in that sense is very dangerous. It gives people a false sense of comfort and security, which is easily falsifiable. So I think that's something that distinguishes the two. There's a lot more skepticism about state policy in Pakistan than there is in India.
Do you think that the Pakistan, history, the problems in Pakistan, sort of how Pakistanis identify ourselves, or how the state identifies itself, is steeped in its wrong or ideologically motivated historical narrative? Because I do think that the idea of the primacy that is given to religion kind of motivates the present events that goes on there.
Anwesh, I've been arguing this for decades, so I'm only smiling because I, of course, agree with that is the great sort of, problem that this sort of fantasized history is guiding there. I mean, it's more illusionary than anything else, if not delusionary. So yes, I would agree with you.
But at the same time, you have to sell a better story, right? So one has to argue that this history is not just true, but it actually tells a better story and helps redefine ourselves.
I would ultimately say that it's not a question even of, I won't even go there. I would just say that it's been corroborated by the nature of historical dynamics. That is the greatest proof. All I argued was that you are making a huge mistake by conflating the nation with religion. There is an extreme importance to study the region. The region complicates this equation between nation and religion. And I think that historical dynamics in the subcontinent are continuing to point to that. I think that is the story that I think corroborates the whatever I've been able to do. But I think that the best test of history that you write is its continued relevance in the present.
But the story that Indians are told is essentially one that, the idea of India, as it were, popularized by Professor Khilnani, is that we are pluralistic, we are a secular democracy.
But Anwesh, if that was so, and if that was deeply inculcated, then India would not be going through what it is going through today. So well, clearly there's something very seriously wrong with it.
I think there were different ideas of India, and one idea is taken over right now, but and I think it has to do with the state, because the state
absolutely. And you're moving from a Nehruvian idea of India to a Hindu Rashtra, and so that has had a long history of simmering. People been wanting it. So they're but I believe that again the mistake that is being made in terms of understanding where India is being taken is that if you focus only on the nation and the religion part of the equation and ignore the region, then you do so at your own peril. And I do think that in the case of India, there is in a dynamic between these three. I call it the overlapping dynamic. I've done this with democracy and authoritarianism, and I think that a corrective will have to set in, because I do think it's a dialectic. It's not one or the other. The overwhelming focus on nation and religion will automatically bring about the regional complexity to alter that. So I think that you'll have to keep watching that dialectic. I think that's the beauty of India because of its size. That is too huge for the nation-religion nexus to become the main one and ignore the regional complexity.
But at the same time, the founding fathers of India were, at least in their public incarnation of that story, were quite clear that we are going to build a democracy that is for everyone, while the founding fathers of Pakistan were at best ambiguous, because Jinnah did say that Sharia will, not be, the laws of Pakistan will not be incompatible with Sharia, that Islamic State is not incompatible with democracy. So things like that, it kind of brings a huge wedge and sort of gives the of religious people an edge, because they can
No,
argue that.
absolutely. I mean, that may be so, but Pakistan, I mean, I think the interesting thing is that this is more a political issue rather than one. I mean, what is the Sharia is a big question. I mean, the Sharia is not some sort of, coded set of legislation that you can pull out of a trunk held by some, clerical elements. Sharia has been constantly negotiated and altered. The problem with the Sharia in the context of South Asia is that it is the Anglo-Mohammedan law. It's a colonial construct. So the issue is not that straightforward. I don't deny that but I mean, the irony, of course, is that the religious element were opposed to Pakistan because Jinnah was not deemed to be adequately religious. And then they, of course, got onto the bandwagon. But it's also important to realize that despite their clamoring throughout the 40s, throughout the 50s, throughout the 60s, it was really only after the mid-70s and under the impact of the global reassertion of Islam, something I've argued in a piece on the global 70s, that it really happens then. I mean, it's the global assertion of Islam that gives the ulama their opportunity in Pakistan. I mean, and the loss of East Pakistan, clearly, for West Pakistan becomes the basis for a shift towards West Asia, a desire for petrodollars. Those are the reasons why Pakistan shifts there, because in the early period, the clerics, I mean, if you study the period, I mean, throughout the 50s and 60s, the clerics are kept under wraps by the state, including the military regime of Ayub Khan. He certainly doesn't get on with them.
But the problem also is that I think many people think that Islam is compatible with democracy or Hinduism is compatible with democracy.
Like India, there is not one view of Islam.
I agree, but the problem is that when the state assumes, the state has a religion, an official religion of the Islamic State or the Islamic Republic or the Hindu State or the Hindu Republic, then one interpretation is always going to be taken over by the other.
I don't disagree. You're absolutely right, because there cannot be one view of the Sharia, because what the Deobandis think is not acceptable to the Barelvis, and what the Barelvis think is not acceptable to the Ahle Hadith, and what the Ahle Hadith think is not acceptable to the Shia. So there's just no end to this. So I think, but I do want to tell you that despite this issue of Sharia and state law, you should know that in the instance of any incompatibility between the two, state law triumphs. This is a basic accepted principle. So I do think that one can make too much of this tussle. The truth of the matter is that they are more, they're using religion, the so-called ideologues of Islam, to carve a niche for themselves more significantly. And I think that needs to be acknowledged. In terms of the earlier, the pre-70s and the post-70s period of what has been happening to religion in the public sphere. Don't deny. But I think it might interest you to know that in matters of the Sharia, which are really crucial, such as issues of interest, whether or not interest-free banking is necessary in Muslim countries. I mean, Pakistan, for all the rhetoric about Islam, cannot move in the direction of rejecting taking interest, because it just cannot operate in the capitalist world system. So I think that's worth keeping in mind, that rhetoric apart, there are many more pragmatic aspects of Islam. People are bending over backwards to show how Islam is not just compatible with democracy, but with capitalism. Islamic banking. What is Islamic banking? I mean, it's just a nomenclature change, and it's all the same. So I think we can make too much of difference. I think that it's again a question of your level of analysis. I mean, if you want to harp on the problem in India as being one of Muslim and Hindu, which I don't think it is. I think these are class socioeconomic problems, but it's the couching of them. I think the categories are more problematic than the reality. And so we need to question the categories through which you analyze your problems, is what I would say.
Would you agree then that in Pakistan it would be better perhaps to separate the state from the from religion
It's not, I
the
mean,
sense
for me to know, I mean, I think that there is the separation of state and religion is fallacious, and it's based on this presumption again.
No, I think the privileging of one religion over other, having
No,
Islam.
the problem, the problem has been that it's a question of state neutrality in matters to do with religion. But I think that there is no neutrality. I mean, the Indian state, we have the perfect example, is bending over backwards to become like Pakistan. I think that's your real problem. I mean, Pakistan we know has a problem, but why is India trying to become like Pakistan?
Well, my question was that wouldn't it be better to have a pluralistic conception of state, not a neutral conception?
I mean, people do have pluralistic conceptions of state. But I do think that the real problem with the religious lobby has been that instead of getting them to come and defend their points of view in parliament, they have been allowed to act as a super parliament. And that is the great fallacy of those who have for all these years tried to separate religion from politics. Religion is inherently involved in politics. And vice versa. So the point is that in the longer history of Islam, those who you call the jurists or the fuqaha, I mean, fiqh was political. I mean, it was the essence of political discourse, and it was not just decided by a handful of people, but it was decided in consultation with the general, with civil society, if you like, with society. So what I'm trying to say is now you have idiotic sort of notions of the Sharia or some aspect of it that you want to implement. I mean, some taken from the Saudis, not even from the Fatwa-e-Alamgiri. So, which Islam are you pulling out of? So, so that is the main, I mean, that is the problem of how Islam is being utilized. So it's a political thing. But I would agree that state neutrality in matters, the states are meant to be extending equal rights of citizenship to all without regard for their caste and creed. And I think that is the citizenship issue that I would support your point absolutely and emphatically. And I think a lot of people do. So I do think that sort of privileging a religious gap. But the point is that whose definition of Muslim are we taking? I mean, if you look at the Munir report of 1953 in Pakistan on the 53 disturbances, I mean, made it clear that no two ulama in Pakistan can agree on the definition of a Muslim. So I would say that is, this is a political issue. I mean, the utilization, the problem in Pakistan and I think in India now too, is not about religion or the lack of and state. It's a question of who defines the religion. I mean, it's the same in India. I mean, Hindutva is not Hinduism. Hinduism is much bigger and people have a different view of it. So I think that those contestations we have to overcome. But my own sense is that people always need some sort of ideology, some sort of a rubric to justify their conflicts. And in the case of India and Pakistan, I think religion comes to their aid. But I think we need to move away from the capital R religion and try to understand what is religious about any of this. It's purely political. We are not discussing our varying conceptions of God. So why call it religious? I mean, it's political.
Right, but do you think Pakistan would perhaps be in a better position if its founding fathers would have been more precise about what the state would be? For instance, I
think Jinnah was quite precise about what the state should be, but I mean, he was deliberately not willing to sort of go beyond stating what it should be, because he said that the state will be what the representatives of the people decide. So you can't be that deterministic. But he was very clear that it was the first statement to the Constituent Assembly. He said that the religion has nothing to do with the affairs of the state. We're all beginning with the principle that we're citizens, equal citizens of one state, regardless. You may go to your mosques, you may go to your temples. So I mean, he said that. So I think that was as clear a vision as you get, but I don't think he could, I mean, it didn't live long enough, but religion itself becomes a contested site. That's the problem, like history. I mean, religion is a very heavily contested site.
Well, this is also true because in an interview to MNS Sarma, who was a journalist, Jinnah said that he would be the protector general of Hindus. Now that Pakistan is achieved, he would try to.
That. I mean, so there are lots of. I think that you need to take a more. I mean, people cherry pick a lot. I think you need to put him into perspective and look at his larger career to understand what he's saying.
Right. So, if you could
wrap up now, because I have something at noon, so I'm sorry about this.
Right. So I wanted to ask you about the future of India-Pakistan relationship, because I think that when it comes to people, I think we want to get along together. We don't want to fight.
I think you're absolutely right.
The state prevents us from doing that.
Unfortunately, under the present scenario where India is undergoing a transition from one type of state to another, I don't foresee a very, any chance of India-Pakistan resolution. I mean, they're apparently carrying on with backroom diplomacy, so I hope that some wisdom will creep through. But publicly, I think at the general public level, they will remain in throes of bitterness and the same old stuff. I don't see. I mean, this is the 75th anniversary of independence and partition. And sadly enough, for all, I just don't think that any improvement is in sight right now. So I'm actually very pessimistic about India and Pakistan.
Well, that's a pessimistic, way to end. But I will say this, that the people of India and Pakistan are absolutely
people are all important. And I can say that if there's any breakthrough of the people dictating state policy, it will take no time. I mean, that's the positive point I can leave you with, that it would take no time for India and Pakistan to, I just don't think the antipathy is as great as is made out at the official level. I think people-to-people relations are fine. It's the politics of it. And I think my only sort of suggestion is that if we stop thinking about our differences in religious terms and think of them as political ordinary problems, then maybe we'll be more. I think it's this religious legitimacy that is sought to our differences that has been at the core of our problems.
Well, let's hope for a better future, Professor
Yes,
Jalal.
we can only hope, because the two nuclear neighbors are very dangerous otherwise. Well, thank you.
It was an honor talking with you.
Take care, Anwesh.
Thank you very much.
All the best.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Bye-bye.